At dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the American political crisis became a war. The familiar explanation is that the North opposed slavery, the South defended it, and the argument could no longer be settled peacefully. That is broadly true, yet it leaves out the machinery that made the dispute so explosive. By the middle of the 19th century, slavery had become more than a brutal labor system. It supported a vast economic order shaping land values, bank loans, political representation, foreign trade, and the future of the American West. The war came because the slave-holding elite believed its wealth, influence, and survival depended on expansion, while a rising northern movement was determined to stop that expansion. To understand why compromise finally failed, we have to begin with the extraordinary value locked inside the slave system. In 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States. Collectively, they represented billions of dollars in property claims under the law of the time. Depending on how historians calculate it, enslaved people were worth more than many of the nation's other major assets combined. For slaveholders, this was not merely a way of organizing labor, it was capital. Enslaved men, women, and children could be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, seized for debt, and used as collateral. A plantation owner could borrow against the value of the people he claimed to own in much the same way another businessman might borrow against land, machinery, or inventory. That fact changes the way the coming of the war looks. Abolition did not appear to the planter class as a modest reform. It threatened to destroy the legal basis of a huge concentration of private wealth. It also threatened the social hierarchy that gave a relatively small group of white slaveholders enormous power over Southern politics. The deeper the system became embedded in finance and law, the harder it became to unwind peacefully. The profits of slavery did not stop at the plantation gate. Cotton passed through merchants, insurers, bankers, shipping firms, brokers, and manufacturers. Southern plantations produced the fiber, northern ports transported it, American and British firms financed it, and mills on both sides of the Atlantic turned it into cloth. By the eve of the war, cotton dominated American exports and supplied much of Britain's textile industry. Southern leaders therefore believed they controlled an economic weapon powerful enough to secure European support if the Union ever broke apart. But before cotton became a diplomatic weapon, slavery had already become a political one. The Constitution gave slave states representation based partly on an enslaved population that could not vote. This strengthened Southern influence in Congress and presidential elections. For decades, political leaders tried to maintain a balance between free states and slave states, especially in the Senate. As long as that balance survived, the South could block measures it considered dangerous. Once it disappeared, the planter elite feared becoming a permanent minority. Inside a nation growing faster in population, industry, and immigration outside the slave states. This is why the Western territories became so important. The central political struggle before the Civil War was not initially a direct federal attempt to abolish slavery inside the states where it already existed. It was a struggle over whether slavery would be allowed to spread into new territory. Every new state raised the same question: would it enter the Union as free or slave? The answer would decide not only local labor arrangements, but the balance of national power. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily contained the crisis. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and Congress drew a geographic line across much of the Louisiana Purchase. North of that line, with a limited exception, slavery would be prohibited. The agreement did not solve the underlying conflict, it merely placed a lid on it. The lid held because both sides believed they still had something to gain from the Union. But expansion kept adding pressure. The annexation of Texas, the war with Mexico, and the acquisition of enormous Western territories forced the question back into national politics. Would slavery move into lands taken from Mexico? Could Congress stop it? Did slaveholders have a constitutional right to carry enslaved people into federal territory? These questions mattered because the slave economy was built to expand. Cotton cultivation pushed planters toward fresh Western land, while the domestic slave trade forced hundreds of thousands of people from the Upper South into the Deep South. Families were separated as plantation agriculture moved toward Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Expansion was not incidental to the system. It was one of its operating principles. Tariffs contributed to sectional tension, especially during the nullification crisis of the early 1830s, when South Carolina claimed a state could reject a federal law it considered unconstitutional. President Andrew Jackson threatened enforcement, and a compromise tariff ended the confrontation. The episode helped preserve a constitutional language of resistance that secessionists later reused. Yet tariffs do not explain the collapse of the Union in 1860. By then, the central dispute was slavery, its protection, expansion, and political power. The next major effort to contain the conflict came in 1850. California entered as a free state, while other Western territories were left to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. At the same time, Congress passed a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. It required federal cooperation in the capture and return of people who had escaped slavery, and it exposed Northern residents to direct involvement in the enforcement of the system. This created an unexpected political reaction. Many white Northerners who had never joined the abolitionist movement were outraged by the sight of alleged fugitives seized in Northern communities. The law made slavery feel less distant. It suggested that the federal government could compel citizens of free states to help sustain an institution they opposed. Resistance grew, while Southern leaders complained that Northern states were refusing to honor constitutional obligations. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The measure allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide the status of slavery for themselves, effectively overturning the old Missouri Compromise restriction. The bill was promoted by Senator Stephen Douglas, who hoped to organize the territories and advance Western development, including a possible transcontinental railroad route. To win Southern support, he accepted a bargain that shattered the political system. The reaction in the North was immediate. Many voters who had tolerated slavery where it already existed were unwilling to accept its possible expansion into territory long considered closed to it. The old Whig Party collapsed under the pressure. A new Republican Party emerged, united not by a program of immediate nationwide abolition, but by opposition to the spread of slavery. That distinction is essential. The early Republican position was threatening to the South precisely because it was politically achievable. Immediate abolition inside the slave states could be dismissed as unconstitutional and radical. Containment was different. Congress could block slavery from the territories. Free states could enter the Union in growing numbers. The Senate could shift permanently toward the North. Over time, slavery might be surrounded, politically isolated, and placed on what Abraham Lincoln called a course toward ultimate extinction. To slaveholders, that future looked like defeat by demographic arithmetic. They understood that the North was gaining population, factories, railroads, banks, and electoral votes. If the West developed as free labor territory, Southern influence would continue to shrink. The issue was not that Lincoln promised to free enslaved people immediately. He did not. The issue was that his movement challenged the expansion on which the political security of slavery depended. Kansas showed what happened when the dispute moved from Congress into the field. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers entered the territory. Elections were manipulated, rival governments formed, and armed groups attacked one another. Towns were raided, homes were burned. John Brown and his followers killed 5 pro-slavery men near Pottawatomie Creek. The conflict, known as Bleeding Kansas, was not yet the Civil War, but it demonstrated that popular sovereignty had not removed the issue from national politics. It had turned the territory into a battlefield. The Supreme Court then made the situation even worse. In the 1857 Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that black Americans descended from enslaved people could not be citizens under the Constitution as the court interpreted it. The court also held that Congress lacked power to prohibit slavery in the federal territories. The ruling went far beyond denying Dred Scott his freedom. It undermined the entire Republican strategy of restricting slavery's expansion. For many Northerners, the decision suggested that slaveholders were using federal institutions to nationalize slavery's protection. Republican warnings about a powerful slave power suddenly seemed more plausible. 2 years later, John Brown attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark an uprising among enslaved people. The plan failed, and Brown was captured and executed. Militarily, the raid was small. Politically, it was enormous. Southern communities feared that Brown represented a wider Northern conspiracy. The admiration he received from some Northern abolitionists convinced many white Southerners that peaceful coexistence was becoming impossible. By 1860, each side treated new events as proof of the other's ultimate intentions. Many Northerners feared that slaveholders wanted to dominate the federal government and spread slavery westward. Many white Southerners believed the North intended to surround and eventually destroy their social order. Compromise was collapsing because neither side trusted what the other would do with future power. The presidential election brought that fear to a climax. Abraham Lincoln won without carrying the Deep South and without appearing on the ballot in much of it. He received less than a majority of the national popular vote, but he won the Electoral College because the opposition was divided. His victory proved that a candidate could become president through Northern electoral strength alone. For the secessionists, this was the moment the balance broke. Lincoln repeatedly said he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. He also rejected the idea that slavery should expand into federal territory. To moderate Unionists, that position left room for negotiation. To the most powerful secessionists, it did not. A presidency committed to containment meant that the long-term growth of slave state power had been stopped. South Carolina left the Union in December 1860. Other Deep South states followed. Their declarations of secession reveal what they believed was at stake. These documents focused repeatedly on slavery, the rights of slaveholders, the return of fugitives, and the hostility of the incoming Republican administration. Mississippi described slavery as its greatest material interest. Georgia defended the economic and political system built around it. South Carolina condemned Northern resistance to the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Fugitive Slave Act. This is why the claim that secession was simply about states' rights cannot stand on its own. The relevant question is always, states' rights to do what? Southern leaders defended state sovereignty when it protected slavery, but they also demanded strong federal enforcement when free states resisted the return of escaped enslaved people. Their constitutional theory shifted depending on which level of government best protected slave property. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens removed any remaining ambiguity in his cornerstone speech, openly identifying racial inequality and slavery as foundations of the new government. The Confederacy was not created in spite of slavery, it was created to preserve a social and economic order built upon it. Yet there is another layer to the story. The Union did not enter the war in 1861 with immediate emancipation as its declared objective. Lincoln's first priority was preserving the United States. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. Their loyalty was strategically vital. Maryland surrounded Washington. Kentucky controlled crucial rivers and routes. Missouri was a gateway to the West. If Lincoln had immediately declared a war of abolition, he risked driving those states into the Confederacy. For that reason, he moved cautiously. Early emancipation orders issued by Union generals were reversed when they threatened national strategy. The administration insisted that the initial war aim was restoration of the Union. This produced a central paradox. Slavery caused secession, but the Union could not immediately fight under an official banner of abolition. The war changed as enslaved people fled to Union lines, deprived the Confederacy of labor, supplied intelligence, and forced federal commanders to confront the meaning of freedom. By 1862, Lincoln had concluded that emancipation had become both a military weapon and a political necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation, effective January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people free in areas still under Confederate control. It did not abolish slavery everywhere. Border states and certain Union-controlled regions were exempt, yet the proclamation changed the meaning of the war. It tied Union victory to the destruction of slavery and authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the United States military. Nearly 180,000 black men ultimately served in the Union Army, with additional service in the Navy. Their participation added manpower to the Union cause and made it increasingly impossible to imagine a restored Union that left slavery intact. Emancipation also transformed foreign diplomacy. Confederate leaders had expected King Cotton to bring Britain or France to their side. They believed European textile dependence would force intervention. The calculation was not irrational. Cotton shortages caused severe hardship in Lancashire and other manufacturing regions. But the strategy failed. European mills found alternative supplies in India, Egypt, and Brazil, while pre-war inventories softened the first shock. Britain also depended on northern grain and wished to avoid a war threatening Canada and Atlantic trade. Once emancipation became a Union aim, open support for a slaveholding republic became even harder to justify. The South had mistaken economic importance for unlimited leverage. Cotton was valuable, but it could not erase the strategic and political risks of intervention. The war exposed the contrast between the two regional systems. The Union had a much larger free population, most manufacturing capacity, a denser railroad network, and a stronger financial base. The Confederacy had skilled officers, defensive geography, and the hope that Northern voters would tire of the cost. Those advantages might have worked in a short war. In a long contest of production, transport, credit, and replacement manpower, the balance favored the Union. Washington raised taxes, issued currency, sold bonds, expanded banking authority, and mobilized industry while the blockade restricted Southern trade. The Confederacy struggled to finance itself. It relied heavily on money creation, contributing to severe inflation. Transportation networks deteriorated. Food shortages worsened. Wealth and enslaved people could not easily be converted into military supplies, especially as Union armies advanced and enslaved workers escaped. The asset that had made the planter class rich was becoming impossible to control. By 1865, slavery had been shattered by self-emancipation, military policy, Union victory, and finally, constitutional change. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. For slaveholders, the destruction of slavery meant the uncompensated loss of legally recognized property claims worth billions of dollars. For the formerly enslaved, it meant legal freedom, but not the land, wealth, security, or political protection necessary to make freedom complete. The economic order changed, but justice remained unfinished. Reconstruction briefly expanded citizenship and political participation. Then, white supremacist violence, discriminatory laws, debt peonage, convict leasing, and sharecropping created new systems of exploitation. The wealth accumulated through generations of forced labor was not transferred to the people whose labor had produced it. Emancipation destroyed ownership in human beings, but it did not erase the inequalities that ownership had created. The war also transformed the federal government. Washington raised armies, imposed new taxes, issued a national currency, expanded banking authority, and asserted the permanence of the Union. With Southern representatives absent, Congress passed the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Acts, and the Morrill Land Grant College Act. These measures accelerated Western settlement, infrastructure, education, and industrial growth. The war destroyed one economic order and strengthened another. That does not mean the conflict can be reduced to a contest between agriculture and industry, or between two neutral models of capitalism. The Southern system was distinctive because its central form of capital was ownership of people. Its political leaders chose secession because they believed slavery could not remain secure inside a union increasingly controlled by voters opposed to its expansion. So the conventional explanation is not wrong. The Civil War was about slavery. The mistake is treating slavery as a single issue separate from economics, finance, law, and political power. Slavery shaped all of them. It determined how land was used, how credit was extended, how congressional power was balanced, how Western expansion was contested, and how the South imagined its place in the global economy. The conflict became unavoidable not because every American had reached a moral decision about slavery, but because the political system could no longer contain the struggle over its future. Compromise had worked only while both sides believed time was on their side. By 1860, the North believed it had finally built the electoral power to stop expansion. The Deep South believed that waiting would make its position weaker. Secession was an attempt to escape that future before it arrived. The tragedy is that the United States spent decades postponing a reckoning with a system embedded in its Constitution, its markets, and its national growth. Each compromise protected the Union for a few more years while allowing the stakes to become larger. By the time the final break came, slavery was worth too much to those who controlled it, too destructive to those trapped within it, and too politically explosive to be contained by another bargain. The Civil War was therefore more than a battlefield struggle over reunion. It was a violent settlement of the question of whether a republic that claimed liberty could continue to expand while treating millions of people as property. It decided that slavery would not shape the future of the West. It established that states could not leave the Union when they lost control of the federal government. And it shifted the United States toward national power, industrial expansion, and a new economic order. But victory did not complete the work. The destruction of slavery ended one system of exploitation while leaving behind the wealth gaps, racial hierarchies, and political conflicts it had produced. That is why the economic history of the Civil War still matters. It shows how an injustice can become so deeply integrated into a society's institutions that removing it threatens not only individual fortunes, but an entire structure of power. Great conflicts rarely begin with a single event. They begin when a system becomes dependent on a contradiction it can no longer manage. In the United States, that contradiction was a nation speaking the language of freedom while building enormous wealth through slavery. For decades, politicians tried to balance it. Bankers financed it, merchants profited from it, courts protected it, and millions suffered under it. In 1861, the balance finally broke. What followed was not simply a war between North and South. It was the collapse of an American order that had made human bondage central to wealth, power, and expansion, and the beginning of a struggle over freedom whose consequences are still visible today.